Rain poured relentlessly over the quiet suburban street, turning the sidewalks into slick mirrors reflecting the flashing red and blue of emergency vehicles. The neighbors had already gathered, their faces pale, eyes wide with the kind of horror that lingers long after the initial shock. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, cordoning off the modest two-story house at the end of the block, the scene of something no one in this sleepy neighborhood could have imagined. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the sharp tang of antiseptic that the first responders tried to wield against the pervasive chaos. Officers moved cautiously, their boots clicking against the hardwood floors, and paramedics whispered hurried instructions, though the answers to their questions were already etched in the stillness of the room. On the living room floor, the body of a young woman lay motionless, her hair fanned around her like a dark halo, eyes wide open as if frozen mid-scream. Broken furniture and shattered glass told the story of a struggle, one that had ended violently, abruptly, leaving a void so palpable that even the most hardened detectives felt its weight. Outside, the murmur of the crowd rose and fell in waves, some crying silently, others holding their children close, unwilling to let them glimpse the nightmare inside. Every flash of the police cameras captured more than just the scene, it captured disbelief, the fragile veneer of normalcy torn apart in a single, tragic moment. For the first responders, for the neighbors, and for the world that would soon watch the news coverage, nothing would ever feel safe again. Detective Rachel Morgan crouched at the edge of the living room, her gloved hands hovering over the scene as though touching it might shatter her own composure. She had seen death before, more times than she cared to count, but this felt different. The victim, a young woman barely in her 20s, was someone who had laughed too loudly in pictures, whose life had seemed full of promise, now reduced to silence on the cold hardwood floor. Rachel's partner, Detective Marcus Hill, walked slowly around the room, eyes scanning every inch for overlooked evidence. They whispered to each other in clipped tones, careful not to disturb anything, but even the carefulness felt inadequate against the weight of the tragedy. Outside, the neighbors' whispers had turned into murmured rumors. Who could have done this? Why here, in their safe little cul-de-sac? The detectives noted the signs, the door forced open, the disarray of personal belongings, the faint marks on the victim's wrists. This was not a random act of violence, it was targeted, intimate, and terrifyingly deliberate. Every photo taken, every fingerprint logged, and every footprint cast in plaster was a testament to the meticulous brutality that had invaded someone's home, someone's life. For Rachel, it was more than a case, it was a personal assault on the fragile sense of safety people clung to. As the crime scene techs worked tirelessly, she couldn't help but notice the small things: a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, a phone left face down with a cracked screen, a calendar still open to last month's dates. Each detail whispered fragments of a life interrupted, a story cut sheer. Outside, the sky darkened further, rain blurring the edges of the world, and with every passing minute, the detectives felt the pressing urgency to find answers before the echoes of this night faded into mere speculation, before the person responsible could slip through the cracks of their pursuit. By the time the sun began to rise, the once sleepy street had become a chaotic hub of flashing lights, investigators, and news crews jockeying for position behind the police barricades. Detective Morgan and Hill had already begun canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions that seemed to yield little more than fear and confusion.
I heard something, but
Every
I was too scared
resident
to
had
look.
their own version of the night's events, but no one claimed to have seen anything that could explain the brutality that had unfolded in the victim's home. The victim's name, Emily Carter, was whispered cautiously by neighbors, as if speaking it too loudly would make the tragedy more real. Morgan had studied her life in the last 48 hours, piecing together photos, social media posts, and the few friends who could speak without collapsing into tears. Emily was the kind of person everyone assumed was untouchable: a bright student, a volunteer at local shelters, someone who always smiled at strangers, but the evidence suggested someone had wanted her gone, and wanted it done violently. Inside the crime scene van, forensic specialists were already analyzing fibers, fingerprints, and traces of DNA, but the complexity of the scene suggested this was no amateur. Someone had planned this, studied her habits, and knew her home intimately. Outside, the press had begun broadcasting the story live, their cameras capturing the collective grief and the subtle panic in a community that had believed itself safe from the horrors of the world. Morgan felt a pang of anger with each passing second, The longer this person remained free, the greater the risk to others. Then, just as she was about to call it a day, a uniformed officer approached with a piece of evidence that would change the trajectory of the investigation, a partial set of fingerprints on the back door, smudged but distinct, pointing to someone familiar with Emily's routine. It was a clue, fragile and incomplete, but enough to ignite a spark of hope in a case that seemed almost too heartbreaking to solve. And in that spark, Morgan knew that the next steps would take them deeper into a world of secrets, betrayals, and unimaginable darkness lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary life. As the detectives sifted through the evidence, the investigation began to paint a picture both chilling and confounding. Emily's friends and family, already reeling from grief, were called in for questioning, their tears and tremors making every answer feel like an impossible riddle. Each conversation revealed fragments of Emily's life, a secret boyfriend no one knew about, a co-worker who had been unusually persistent, an ex-friend whose jealousy had simmered for months. Every lead, however, came with contradictions, forcing the detectives to weigh lies, half-truths, and genuine fear against the sparse physical evidence. Morgan couldn't help but feel the personal toll of the case. Each detail of Emily's life was like a knife twisting in her chest, and every misstep could allow the perpetrator to slip away. Hill focused on the technical side, cross-referencing social media activity, phone records, and security footage from nearby homes, looking for any anomaly that could connect to the prints found on the back door. But the deeper they delved, the more convoluted the web became, revealing a network of people who had intersected with Emily in ways that were innocent on the surface but, under scrutiny, revealed simmering conflicts and potential motives. Outside, the community remained on edge, parents holding their children tighter, neighbors peering through curtains, the shadow of fear stretching across the block like an uninvited guest. Each night, as Morgan left the precinct and drove past the darkened streets, she imagined Emily's face, her laughter frozen mid-moment, her plans forever paused, and it became a haunting reminder that the clock was ticking. Somewhere out there, the person who had shattered a life was moving freely, possibly watching the very same news coverage, possibly blending in with the crowd, and the detective's race against time had only just begun. Every lead mattered, every detail was a thread, and if they missed even one, it could mean the difference between justice and yet another life destroyed. It was late one night when the breakthrough came, almost as if fate had intervened in the darkest hours. Detective Hill was reviewing hours of security footage from nearby streets when a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadowy figure, moving cautiously but deliberately, passing Emily's house in the hours leading up to the attack. The image was grainy, almost unrecognizable, but there was something in the posture, the hesitation, the deliberate pacing, that suggested familiarity with the property. Morgan, hunched over the evidence table, barely breathed as Hill rewound the footage repeatedly, enhancing angles and lighting, trying to extract anything usable. Forensic teams had also begun matching the partial fingerprints from the back door with national databases, and a rare and alarming coincidence, had come back. The prints belonged to someone with a prior record, someone who had been released recently and had a history of obsession and stalking. Morgan felt a cold shiver run down her spine, the realization that Emily's attacker had likely watched her, planned meticulously, and waited for the perfect moment to strike made the crime even more haunting.
I know
Meanwhile,
this is incredibly
the victim's
difficult,
family,
but we do have some movement on the case.
were being informed piece by piece,
We've identified
their shock
a person
and
of
grief
interest.
giving way to a fragile
We've been
glimmer
working
of hope,
around the clock.
though the emotional
The
toll
new
was
evidence
already
gives us a
staggering.
strong lead.
In the neighborhood, whispers turned to speculation. Could the monster be one of them, someone they had smiled at, someone who had blended seamlessly into their lives? As the detectives pieced together phone records, social media interactions, and witness accounts, a picture emerged of a person who was calculating, intelligent, and frighteningly close to the victim's world. Every call, every message, every online interaction was scrutinized for hidden meaning, for the small cracks that might expose the perpetrator. And yet, even with these new leads, the case remained a complex puzzle. Each revelation seemed to raise more questions than it answered, deepening the sense of urgency. Morgan knew they were close, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it could become, for Emily's family, for the detectives, and potentially for others who might cross the path of someone so meticulously ruthless. Detectives and officers inside a dimly lit precinct late at night, faces weary and tense, papers and evidence scattered across desks, atmosphere thick with exhaustion and mental strain, Silent acknowledgement of pressure weighing on the investigation plus Detective Rachel Morgan, female detective in her late 30s, short brown hair, sharp eyes, professional attire with dark blazer and practical shoes, gloves on at crime scene, intense and focused expression. Detective Marcus Hill, male detective, early 40s, closely cropped hair, serious demeanor, casual detective attire, buttoned shirt, slacks, jacket, calm but alert, inspecting evidence with precision. Emily's parents sat in the precinct conference room, hands intertwined, their eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and the relentless replaying of the worst-case scenario in their minds. Every photograph of Emily brought fresh waves of grief, each memory now tinged with the horror of her absence. Her younger brother, barely 16, struggled to understand why the world could allow such cruelty, and Morgan felt her own heart break for him as she tried to answer questions that had no satisfactory explanations. Meanwhile, the detectives were running on fumes, poring over the minutiae of the case in search of patterns, but the closer they got to answers, the more elusive the truth seemed. Leads overlapped, alibis conflicted, and a cloud of uncertainty hovered over every interaction. Even with the partial fingerprint match and the security footage, the suspect's identity remained frustratingly vague, as if he were deliberately keeping just enough distance to evade detection. Every new detail from Emily's social life, her recent arguments, her cautious interactions with strangers online, a few cryptic text messages added layers to the mystery, painting a portrait of a young woman who had been unknowingly navigating a hidden threat. At the same time, the neighborhood's anxiety escalated. Windows stayed shuttered, doors locked, and every stranger drew suspicious glances. For Morgan and Hill, the tension was twofold: the urgency to protect potential future victims and the responsibility to bring justice for Emily before the grief transformed into rage or despair for those left behind. Late nights bled into early mornings, and each new lead, no matter how minor, carried the weight of life-altering consequences. The detectives understood that this case was no longer just about solving a crime, it was about stopping someone who could strike again, someone who had studied Emily's life and was capable of doing it all over. Every interaction, every subtle clue, now held potential answers, and the investigators were determined to unravel the threads before the darkness that had entered their community could strike again. Days blurred into nights as the detectives followed a tightening circle of leads, each one drawing them closer to the person who had shattered Emily's life.
Look at the time.
The suspect's movements, once erratic and hidden, began to form a pattern: late-night trips, brief visits to familiar places, subtle interactions with friends and acquaintances, all weaving a map that the detectives painstakingly reconstructed. Morgan felt the weight of every decision, knowing that a single misstep could allow the perpetrator to vanish again, leaving Emily's family in despair and potentially putting others at risk. The pressure was unrelenting. Each conversation with informants, each piece of digital evidence, carried the threat of danger, yet also the hope of closure. Meanwhile, Emily's parents tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of fear had taken root, making even routine activities feel fraught with threat. Morgan and Hill studied the suspect's background meticulously: past offenses, social connections, employment history, and even minor patterns of behavior that might reveal a psychological profile. They discovered that the individual had an unsettling familiarity with surveillance techniques, knew how to erase digital footprints, and had displayed obsessive tendencies in previous incidents. As the evidence mounted, a tense sense of inevitability filled the air. If they acted too soon, the suspect could slip away. If they waited too long, another tragedy could occur. The detectives coordinated with tactical teams, planning a careful approach that balanced safety with the urgency of apprehension. Every step was calculated, every decision scrutinized, and yet, despite all precautions, the human element, the unpredictability of fear, desperation, and impulse loomed over the operation like a storm waiting to break. Morgan could feel it in her gut. The moment of confrontation was approaching, and once it arrived, lives would change forever, for better or worse. In that waiting, tense lull, the city seemed to hold its breath, suspended between the horror that had already occurred and the possibility of justice finally being served. The night of the arrest was suffused with tension, so thick it felt almost tangible. Morgan, Hill, and the tactical team approached the small apartment where the suspect had been tracked, the streets outside eerily silent except for the occasional hum of distant traffic. Every step toward the door was measured, every breath held, as if the slightest noise could shatter the fragile balance between life and death. Inside, the suspect was unaware, or perhaps pretending to be, completely oblivious to the storm about to descend. The detectives had spent days studying his habits, predicting his patterns, and now it all came down to this one decisive moment. When the door swung open, the flash of weapons, the authoritative commands, and the sudden shock of the suspect's realization created a moment frozen in time. The man, cornered and frantic, attempted to resist, but the team's coordination left no room for escape. Within minutes, he was restrained, cuffed, and escorted out as the weight of his actions began to settle on his face, pale and haunted. Morgan watched him being led away, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and lingering horror flooding through her. For Emily's family, who had been brought to a safe distance, the news hit like a wave. They wept openly, their grief mingling with the first sense of closure they had felt since the nightmare began. The neighbors, once tense and fearful, began to exhale collectively, though the scars of the trauma would remain. In that moment, justice, though imperfect, had been served, and the sense of helplessness that had haunted everyone since the crime was, finally, met with action. Yet even in the relief, the detectives knew the aftermath of such violence was far from over. The emotional residue, the questions of why, and the haunting images of what had been lost would linger long after the handcuffs clicked into place. Morgan stepped back, letting the scene unfold around her, silently promising that every remaining detail, every trace of evidence, would be meticulously documented not just for the case, but for the memory of a young woman whose life had been stolen too soon.
Freeze!
The night the detectives moved in,
Police!
the city seemed to hold its breath.
Get on the
Morgan,
ground now!
Hill, and the tactical team crouched in the shadows outside the suspect's apartment, hearts hammering with anticipation and nerves stretched taut like high wires. Rain-slicked streets reflected the flashing lights of police cruisers, and even the distant hum of traffic seemed unusually loud in the tense stillness. Inside, the suspect paced the cramped apartment, unaware of how closely every movement had been tracked, every habit mapped, every detail analyzed. Morgan signaled, and in a coordinated flurry, the team breached the door. The sudden burst of light and shouts made the suspect freeze, panic overtaking him as he realized escape was impossible. He lunged in desperation, but the team was precise, containing him within moments, the echo of handcuffs snapping shut reverberating like a final judgment. Morgan's eyes met the suspect's, a flicker of defiance quickly replaced by shock and fear, and in that instant, the nightmare that had consumed the neighborhood, Emily's family, and the detectives themselves began to feel a sliver of resolution. Outside, Emily's parents were guided to safety, their tears flowing freely, grief colliding with relief in a storm of emotion. The neighbors, who had lived in fear for days, peered through windows, some weeping, some holding each other tight, the collective tension of the community finally breaking. Even as the suspect was led away, Morgan knew the road ahead would not be easy. Trauma leaves invisible scars, and justice, while necessary, could not erase the horror that had unfolded. But for this moment, at least, the palpable terror that had gripped their lives was confronted, controlled, and finally brought into the light, leaving behind a fragile sense of hope in the wake of unspeakable tragedy. The trial was a relentless storm of emotion, media scrutiny, and painstaking testimony. Courtrooms that had once seemed distant and sterile became arenas of raw grief, anger, and the desperate quest for justice. Emily's parents attended every session. Holding each other tightly, their faces etched with sorrow and exhaustion, yet determined to see the process through. Friends, neighbors, and witnesses recounted their memories, their statements painting a fuller picture of Emily's life and the terror she had endured. The prosecution meticulously laid out the evidence, the fingerprints, the security footage, the digital trails, building a case that was both damning and heartbreaking. Meanwhile, the defense tried to cast doubt, arguing inconsistencies and ambiguities, but the overwhelming weight of the evidence, coupled with the meticulous work of Morgan, Hill, and the forensic teams, left little room for escape. Media coverage amplified the emotional intensity, broadcasting the story nationwide, sparking conversations about safety, obsession, and the fragility of ordinary lives. For the community, it was a reminder that horror could strike anywhere, at any time, and that even the most familiar streets could hide danger behind closed doors. Emily's family, while still grappling with the devastating loss, began to find solace in small moments of vindication as the suspect's demeanor in court revealed the chilling truth of his guilt. The trial was not just a legal process, it was a reckoning, a painstaking acknowledgement of the suffering inflicted, and a stage for justice to assert itself in a world that had been upended by violence. For Morgan and Hill, watching the case unfold in court brought a complicated mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The perpetrator would be held accountable, yet the void left by Emily's absence was permanent. Outside the courthouse, the rain mirrored the tears of countless onlookers, the city collectively mourning while slowly, tentatively, allowing the first rays of healing to break through the darkness. Months after the trial, the neighborhood still carried the weight of what had happened, a subtle unease lingering in the air like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Emily's family moved cautiously forward, learning to navigate a world forever altered by loss. Grief tempered by the knowledge that justice had been served. The house where she had lived remained empty for a time, a silent monument to the life that had been stolen and the violence that had shattered innocence. Morgan and Hill returned to their routines, yet the case left indelible marks on their minds, haunting dreams, and quiet moments where Emily's face would appear unbidden, a reminder of why they had chosen this path. The community, while slowly healing, remained vigilant, more aware of the fragility of everyday life and the hidden darkness that can lurk behind familiar doors. In conversations, in memorials, in small acts of remembrance, Emily's presence persisted, her story a cautionary tale of vigilance, empathy, and the human capacity to endure unimaginable loss. Though the perpetrator was imprisoned, the emotional scars extended far beyond bars. The echoes of that night, of screams unheard and lives interrupted, lingered in hearts and minds. And yet, amid sorrow, there was resilience, a determination to honor her memory through vigilance, compassion, and the relentless pursuit of justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Emily's story became a testament not only to tragedy but also to the strength of human connection, the courage of those who confront evil, and the enduring hope that even in the darkest circumstances, accountability and memory can prevail. It was a heartbreaking chapter in the lives of many, but one that also illuminated the extraordinary capacity of people to care, act, and never forget the fragile beauty of life that had been lost too soon. Even years later, Emily's story reverberated through the community, a haunting reminder that tragedy leaves ripples far beyond the immediate victims. Local schools implemented awareness programs on personal safety, parents became more vigilant, and neighbors who had once ignored each other began to communicate, forming a fragile network of trust built from shared trauma. Morgan and Hill, though seasoned and resilient, often reflected privately on the case, knowing that some losses could never be fully reconciled, yet taking solace in the lives they may have protected through their diligence. Memorials, both official and informal, appeared across the city. A bench in a park, flowers left at the street corner, a small scholarship in Emily's name, acts of remembrance that allowed the living to channel grief into purpose. Yet even amidst these gestures, the shadow of what had occurred lingered, shaping conversations about obsession, warning signs, and the quiet dangers hidden behind ordinary lives. Journalists continued to reference the case in discussions of crime prevention, while social media memorials kept her story alive, ensuring that Emily's life, though tragically short, would not be forgotten. The arrest and conviction had brought justice, but the emotional and psychological aftermath reminded everyone that while the legal system can punish, it cannot erase the memory of loss. And in this truth lay a solemn lesson: tragedy may strike without warning, but human resilience, vigilance, and collective memory ensure that lives lost are honored, stories are told, and communities, though scarred, continue to persevere. Over time, Emily's story became more than a cautionary tale. It became a lens through which the community examined its own vulnerabilities. Local authorities held workshops on recognizing early signs of stalking and obsessive behavior, while mental health professionals emphasized the importance of support networks and early intervention. Morgan and Hill found themselves occasionally speaking at community events, their recounting of the case both sobering and instructive, a reminder that vigilance could save lives even when evil seemed undetectable. Emily's family, while never fully healed, channeled their grief into advocacy, reaching out to other families affected by violent crimes, offering comfort, advice, and a shared understanding of life upended by tragedy. The streets that once felt ordinary now carried stories embedded in their cracks and corners, each neighbor more attentive, more aware, more protective of the fragile thread of life that connected them all. Yet, the haunting reality remained. For every closure achieved through law and justice, there existed the quiet persistence of memory, grief, and the shadows of what had been lost. Social media, podcasts, and local news continued to reference the case, not for sensationalism, but as a point of discussion on empathy, safety, and human resilience. Emily's life, though tragically brief, influenced countless others to take precautions, value connections, and recognize that ordinary days are precious and fragile. Morgan and Hill, now seasoned veterans of countless cases, often reflected on Emily's courage indirectly, her routine life, her small joys, her aspirations all stolen in a single night, reminding them of the humanity behind every statistic, every report, and every crime scene. In these reflections, the community found a bittersweet truth. While tragedy leaves scars that never fully fade, it can also inspire vigilance, compassion, and a collective commitment to honor those who were taken too soon.